pressing on. All my distress is going gone. Pressing on. I'm pressing on.
My fellow YouTubers, rumours of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. I am the one and only Impulse Kid 86, and this is my review for the PlayStation 2 version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, originally released in arcades way back in the year 2000. Unlike its predecessor, MVC2 actually ends up doing away with standalone endings in favour of a linear storyline that sees the French pirate Ruby Heart gathering all the Capcom and Marvel characters together to help her take down the monstrosity known as Abyss, the Armour of Destruction, and prevent it from turning the planet into a barren wasteland. While all the crazy crossover antics and wildly intense hyper combos that made the original Marvel vs. Capcom a classic remain intact, gameplay takes a few steps up by not only introducing things like aerial raves and the snapback ability, which briefly forces a warrior out of the battle, but also allowing for 3-on-3 battles and jacking up the character count to an impressive 56 characters, although only 24 are immediately playable. Some of the new faces this legendary beat-em-up introduces include the time-travelling X-Man Cable, the bone-sprouting Morlock Marrow, the mummified Pharaoh Anakaris and Catwoman Felicia from Darkstalkers, Resident Evil's Jill Valentine, decked out in her RE2-era STARS uniform, and finally, the anthropomorphic cactus Amingo and monkey girl Sonson, both of whom join Ruby Heart in being created specifically for this game. Outside of the main arcade mode, the console version also includes the obligatory versus and training modes, as well as a score attack mode and secret factor option that grants the ability to purchase things like characters, costumes, stages, and more, using points that are earned as you play. Speaking of characters, I'd like to take a moment to straight up address my biggest complaint with this title. From a competitive standpoint, I find it an absolute shame that out of so many characters, the number of decently balanced ones are completely outweighed by the number that are either tremendously overpowered, a la Cable, Sentinel, Magneto, and Storm, to name some of whom I believe are the biggest offenders due to just how quickly matches can end when they come into play, coupled with the near obscene amount of times I saw them being used around the arcade scene, or practically useless. As GameSpot so succinctly put it in their review of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, MVC2 was a game so heavily dominated by a mere handful of characters and strategies that the rest of its design is rendered moot. Of course, I realise that no game is perfect and things like an imbalanced roster are probably to be expected in a game that features so many characters, but I still find it upsetting, and I'm happy to hear that Capcom appears to have learned from their mistakes with this installment when making the third game. Now, before anyone starts giving me grief, I'm not going to say that MVC3 is without its own problems, but I'll get to that in my review for that game. The controls for the PS2 version work well enough, although I found them kind of awkward and they took a while for me to get used to. The square and triangle buttons respectively perform light and heavy punches, while the X and circle buttons allow for light and heavy kick attacks. Furthermore, you can bring one of your two partners into the fight by pressing either both punch buttons or both kick buttons depending on which character you want to fight with. Meanwhile, the L1 and L2 buttons can be used to temporarily summon your partners for assist attacks. The graphics represent an interesting blend of the second and third dimensions, in that although the fisticuffs take place on a 2D plane, the stages are rendered in full 3D using Capcom's Naomi engine, while the character models remain simple, hand-drawn sprites. Understandably, the sprites stick out like a sore thumb against the computer-generated backgrounds, which makes the game reasonably jarring to look at first. Not to mention that the PS2 version, or at least my copy of it, will start seriously lagging if the screen becomes too busy. I'm not sure if this carries over to the other console versions, but thankfully it doesn't detract too much from the overall experience. However, I must say that in my honest opinion, the soundtrack to this game is lackluster. I don't have any issues in particular about the voiceover work, aside from everything the announcer says sounding like a garbled mess, but the background music is absolutely terrible! I have no doubt that the soundtrack has its fans, and I honestly don't think the music is that bad on its own merits, but within the context of a fighting game, jazz music should rarely, if ever, be utilised. If I may take a moment to be completely honest, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is one of those games I've been extremely reluctant to review for some time now, because as I learned not long after I started this gig back in 2007, not everyone's gonna like what they hear. But now that the review is up for all to see, I'm just gonna say my piece and move on. Although I honestly don't hate MVC2, I'm not afraid to say that while there is fun to be had, especially when playing against friends, I also felt that there are a couple of missteps, the biggest point of contention being the severely imbalanced character roster. That said, besides the flashy beat-em-up action, the game does carry a decent amount of replayability to it thanks to the point system used to unlock all the hidden goodies, and all things considered, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is an interesting middle chapter in what is arguably one of the greatest fighting game trilogies of all time.
KO. You win.